These are the notes that go along with Chapter 4.1, Species, Communities, and Ecosystems, part of Chapter 4 on ecology. In ecology, we often do a lot of counting members of the population or measuring population changes. But it's important to remember that all of these ecosystems that we're currently looking at are very cyclical. So ecosystems are generally built up and established and routinely destroyed. So it's important to remember that these events are all interdependent and cyclical and not static but ever changing. When we study ecology, one of the most specific things that we're going to look at is a species. Okay, so species are a very particular group of organisms in an ecosystem, and those are organisms that can interbreed, so they can produce offspring of their own. Okay, and that offspring can produce its offspring of its own. So they have to be able to produce offspring, and that offspring in turn has to be fertile as well. So the reason why humans and alligators aren't the same species is because human and alligators can't produce offspring together. I really wouldn't try that. Now, most of the time, members of the same species have similar physical characteristics. Okay, so all dogs have 4 legs, they have a tail, they have fur, they're super cute. They may not look exactly the same, so there may be some differences there. But again, if they're a member of the same species, which all dog breeds are, they can reproduce and make fertile offspring. Their gene pools are very distinct from other organisms, so they have different genes or different versions of genes, and they have a common phylogeny or a common family tree. But if you're asked to define a species, remember that you're talking about a group of organisms that can interbreed and create fertile offspring. We do have to be careful when we talk about species in terms of what it means to be a species. There are some members of separate species that can interbreed. For example, I can make a zorse. They're kind of ugly. I wouldn't do that. Okay, but you can make a zorse by mating a zebra and a horse together. So why aren't zebras and horses considered the same species? Well, because zorses, their babies, aren't fertile. They can't produce offspring of their own. This is a really rare phenomenon. We can't really do this with a whole lot of species because you have to have similar number of chromosomes and similar genes and stuff like that. But it is possible in a rare number of cases, like ligers, okay, like zorses and other examples, to produce offspring that isn't fertile between members of separate species. But again, not the same species or not producing fertile offspring. Some other examples of exceptions, some members of the same species don't interbreed because they're separated by long distances. So people living on the island of Hawaii and people living on the coast of Greenland are probably too far apart to interbreed, but it doesn't mean they're not the same species. Okay, because I bet if we put them together, they could interbreed, they're just not. Some organisms reproduce asexually, so what do we do there? Because I can't take one bacterium and make it mate with another bacterium to see if it produces fertile offspring. So for asexual reproducing organisms, we can't really use that interbreeding definition. We really have to take a closer look at genetics to determine if they're the same species. And within some species or populations, some individuals are infertile. They may have something wrong with their physiology or their anatomy that's preventing individuals from mating. And so then we can't really use that interbreeding definition. But as a whole, the ability to produce fertile offspring is what we're going to use as our definition for a species. So again, we're back to this notion of the exception to the rule in which 2 members of different species can actually mate together and make a baby. They can produce offspring. And these are what we call hybrids, the offspring of two similar but different species. And again, I know they're different species because things like this, okay, the donkey, are not fertile. Okay, they can't produce babies of their own. So that means horses and donkeys aren't the same species. Okay, there's a couple of examples here. They generally don't occur in nature. And that's because this guy sees this guy not as a potential mate, okay, but as something from a completely different species. Kind of why humans don't generally find cows attractive. We can't mate with them, we can't produce offspring, so there's no physiological drive to mate with them. It doesn't occur in nature very often. So, how did all of these species come to be different? Okay, why do we have such a great degree of biodiversity? Well, a couple things have to happen. Okay, first of all, these species have to be separated, and that separation has to occur over long periods of time. So, over millions of years, okay, these species might evolve a little bit differently because they come to occupy different habitats or different environments. And in these different environments, different characteristics or traits become advantageous in these different environments, okay, and they evolve separately. Over time, they lose the ability to reproduce. So if they can't reproduce any longer, now we're back to our definition of what it means to be a species, and these two are no longer the same species. So oftentimes populations that become separated, whether it's a geographic separation or a separation in mating seasons or behaviors, doesn't matter. The separation, if it occurs long enough, they're likely to evolve into separate species and lose that ability to reproduce and create fertile offspring. And that is how we get separate species. Later on in the year, we're going to talk about different ways to classify all of the different species on Earth, all of this great variation in biodiversity. One of the ways that we can separate or classify these species is into two groups called autotrophs and heterotrophs. And as we're looking at how these species interact within their communities and their ecosystems, it's important to be able to understand the difference between these two. Now, how are we getting these words? Well, this word troph comes from the Greek to eat, okay? And if we're looking at this word auto means self. This does not mean that they eat themselves. This means that they provide their own food, which they can eat. So autotrophs are organisms that synthesize or make organic molecules from inorganic molecules. Most of the ones that we're going to study are doing that through the process of photosynthesis. We have other names for them, including the word producer. So for our usage, okay, autotroph and producer means the same thing. They're making their own food. These guys are at the bottom of every food chain. They're there in really large numbers. Includes plants, algae, and some bacteria. Again, they're making their own food. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, again, troph meaning to eat or having to do with food. Hetero means different. So here we're talking, these guys are having to eat different organisms. We also call them consumers. So in contrast to the autotrophs, which produce food, these guys consume food. These are our animals, our fungi, some bacteria, also some protists, which we'll get into. Okay, but huge difference here between producers and consumers, also called autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, producers, autotrophs, it's pretty self-explanatory. They're creating their own food, usually using the process of photosynthesis. But we have several different types of consumers, and a lot of those types are differentiated based on what they're consuming. So again, they have to eat to obtain their energy and their vital molecules, but what they're eating can vary widely. They can either eat producers, so most of the time they're eating plant products or bacteria or algae, something like that, or they can eat other consumers, other heterotrophs, okay, like if they're eating another animal or the products of those animals. Most consumers, or at least a lot of the ones that we're familiar with, are eating things that are alive. They're eating live animals, or they're eating live plants, or they're eating parts of those animals or plants. But we do have a couple exceptions to those, and they're really important exceptions because without them, our nutrient cycles would be non-existent. And one of those examples are the detritivores. Okay, and detritivores eat something called detritus, which is non-living organic matter. So this means that they're eating things that used to be alive, like dead leaves, feces, okay, like my friend the dung beetle here eating poo, okay, or they're eating carcasses. Common examples here include earthworms, dung beetles, okay, lots of our insects, detritivores, are also, and you may want to add this to your notes, they are internal digesters, okay? So they actually consume what they eat, okay? So these pieces of feces are going to go in one end of the dung beetle, okay, and out the other. They are internally digesting this detritus, this non-living organic matter. And that's very different from the next type of consumer that we have. And those are the saprotrophs. Okay, saprotrophs kind of do the same thing as detritivores. They're still eating non-living organic matter. Again, dead plants, dead bodies, feces, etc. But instead of internally digesting it, instead of eating it and breaking those molecules down internally, they digest their food externally, so on the outside of their bodies. They're so super cool. How do they do that? Well, these saprotrophs, like these mushrooms, will actually spray digestive juices onto whatever they're eating. Those digestive juices break down those non-living organic molecules, and then the mushrooms will reabsorb the digested materials. So the digestion, the breaking down of the molecules, is actually taking place outside of their body. Now, all decomposers, okay, so the saprotrophs and the detritivores are very important to the ecosystems because they are the great recyclers, okay? They take dead things and they break down the nutrients to make them available for other organisms to use. Without these saprotrophs and detritivores, we would just have a bunch of dead things laying around, and all of the important nutrients that are in those dead things would be stuck in there. Okay, they wouldn't be returned to the rest of our food chains. So they break these dead things down. Those broken down things usually end up back in the soil where they can be absorbed by plants or other producers and return to our food chain. So there are great recyclers. So we've talked about species, right? Members of a population that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And we've talked about different types of species. So autotrophs, heterotrophs, within the heterotrophs, different types of consumers like detritivores and saprotrophs. So what do we call different species living in similar areas? Well, that would be a population. So populations are groups of the same species living in the same area, like a population of rabbits, a population of maple trees, a population of gray mice, whatever. When we have several populations living and interacting with each other in the same area, that's what we call a community. Okay, so these several different types of fish, so there would be one population interacting with another population in the same area. And that interaction can either be feeding on one another, um, providing substances for one another, getting protection, okay, just interacting in any way in the same space at the same time. So population, same species, community, different populations living in the same area. On that last slide, when we were looking at that community, okay, or what I was telling you with the community, it's actually a picture of an ecosystem, because an ecosystem encompasses all of the living components, okay? So here I have things that are living or biotic, like these buffalo, like the grass, and of course like the things we can't see, like bacteria, the earthworms, etc. And it has abiotic factors. Okay, so things like water, things like rocks. Abiotic factors can also include things like sunshine, temperature, humidity, etc. Okay, so a community only accounts for those living things. An ecosystem, on the other hand, includes the living or biotic things in addition to the abiotic factors. One of the more important biotic factors in a successful ecosystem are the autotrophs. Okay, so again, just to review, autotrophs get their nutrients. They can do it from a variety of ways. We're mainly going to focus on them using the process of photosynthesis. Okay, and any autotroph, regardless of whether they're using photosynthesis or something else, are going to make organic compounds like sugars from inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide and water. So they are producing, okay, all of the food that we're then going to use in the rest of the food chain. So food chains, as we're going to learn in the next section in chapter 4, involve the transfer of energy. Now, energy flows through Earth's ecosystem. What do I mean? Well, it comes into Earth's system via the sun, okay? And then it flows from there into autotrophs like plants, okay? It gets turned into chemical energy like glucose, which is then eaten by other organisms, okay? It eventually leaves the Earth's atmosphere again as heat given off by those organisms. So this energy is flowing through Earth's ecosystems, okay? Nutrients, on the other hand, are a very different story. Nutrients don't flow through. Nutrients get cycled, and that's because Earth is what we call a closed system. The nutrients that we have here on Earth, the amount of carbon, the amount of nitrogen, the amount of iron, the amount of sulfur, the amount of oxygen, etc., whatever we have is all we're ever going to have. Barring any special deliveries from spacecraft or from meteorites that fall through Earth's atmosphere, whatever we have here on Earth is all we're going to have, and those nutrients just get recycled, okay? So the energy flows through, but the nutrients have to get recycled. We're going to talk about several different types of cycles and focus more closely on a few of them. As we're talking about these nutrient cycles, it's easy to get caught up in things like food chains, because food chains are linear, right? Okay, so they go from like plants, that's a tree, okay, to things that eat things from trees, like, I don't know, I should have thought of a better example that was easier to draw, but like giraffes, oh my gosh, this is bad. That's a giraffe. Okay, so it's easy to understand how things go from plants to animals, okay? Any nutrients that's in the plant is going to go to whatever's eating the plant. But don't forget, since Earth is a closed system, the nutrients that are locked in this organism have to then get returned to the soil so that we can start that cycling over again. And that, of course, is the job of decomposers. Remember, decomposers are our saprotrophs, our external digesters like fungi, and our detritivores, our internal digesters, okay, like bacteria and some other things, earthworms, etc. And what they're doing is they're converting organic matter into a form that's more useful for another organism. So they're taking those nutrients and dead things and returning them to the soil. I just don't want you to forget, okay, that they're a really important process of returning those nutrients so that these nutrients can actually cycle through. So here's the basic thought behind nutrient cycling and how our ecosystems maintain sustainability over long periods of time. It's all going to start with our producers, because the producers take inorganic things like carbon dioxide from the air or water from the ground, and they transform them through the magical process of photosynthesis and other processes into organic compounds like glucose, like sugars. So going from inorganic to organic, that's what makes these guys so super cool. They can convert those into those sugars into larger sugars or into starches, things like that. They can also produce other important molecules like lipids and proteins, which we know consumers are then going to need also. So it all starts here with our producers. From there, consumers, like animals or something like that, are going to eat the producers. So whatever was in the producers then gets transferred to the consumers. Those complex molecules are digested into smaller things like glucose or amino acids. Okay, when those consumers die, their cells are broken down by decomposers, and then those nutrients are returned back to the soil. So we get this cyclical, nutrient cycle. We can simulate this process by building what's called a mesocosm. We're going to do that very shortly. And mesocosms are kind of like a model for the earth. And this mesocosm has been sustainable, self-sustaining since the 70s. That's pretty cool. I'm pretty sure this guy built it himself. He's old, but never mind. Okay, so what's going on in here is energy is coming in from the sun. Okay, remember, energy can flow through ecosystems, but it's closed. Notice this cork on here. So all of the nutrients that are in here, stay in here. They can't get any new ones. They're not losing anything. Producers are turning inorganic compounds, that they're finding in this system into organic things like sugar. Consumers, there's probably bacteria, maybe some small insects in here, are eating those producers. When those consumers die, they're being broken down by bacteria and other decomposers in the soil. So the nutrients that are stuck in those consumers return to the soil. The producers reabsorb them again, and this cycle continues over long periods of time. So when I say things like nutrients, those nutrients can be a lot of different things, Regardless of what kind of nutrient we're talking about, they all cycle. Remember, Earth is a closed system. We're going to talk a lot more about oxygen and the carbon cycle. But what I want to take a look at now is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen often gets overlooked, but it's super important. A lot of our biomolecules depend on nitrogen. I'm thinking specifically of proteins and nucleic acids like DNA. So we know that we regularly need to make proteins and DNA. Where are we getting that nitrogen from, and what's happening to it when we die? So let's take a closer look at that nitrogen cycle. I want to apologize in advance for how horrible this drawing is going to be. I'm looking forward to looking at your notes and seeing what wonderful artist you are and how much better you are at drawing than me. But anyways, I'm going to separate my drawing kind of into two spots, because the nitrogen cycle really takes place in a couple of spots. So we have the atmosphere, and we have the soil. So I'm going to draw an example of the nitrogen cycle on a terrestrial place, in a terrestrial biome. That means on land. This still happens in marine and other aquatic ecosystems. It would just be underwater, not in the soil. And so one of the things that kind of bridges the gap between the atmosphere and the soil are plants. So I'm going to draw a tree here. Okay. Trees have roots, all these other things, okay, branching down into the soil. Now, plants need nitrogen, okay, and you would think that plants get their nitrogen from the atmosphere. That would make sense because they're absorbing a lot of other things from the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, okay, and nitrogen actually makes up the majority of the gases in our atmosphere. Unfortunately for plants, the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere isn't in the correct form. Okay, so how does nitrogen get converted into the correct form for plants? Well, that happens in the soil. Nitrogen is absorbed, okay, into the soil and is fixed by what we call nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, so that nitrogen is absorbed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they literally fix it or convert it into a form that plants can use. Okay, now when they do that, then that nitrogen is able to be absorbed by the plant roots, okay, and that nitrogen becomes part of the plant. Okay, well, here's my favorite giraffe again. Okay, this giraffe needs nitrogen just like all animals or organisms do to build its DNA and its protein. How does that nitrogen make it into the giraffe? Well, simple. The giraffe eats the plant. When the plant gets eaten by the giraffe, any nitrogen that was in the plant is now part of the giraffe. Okay? Now, how does this nitrogen get back to atmospheric nitrogen? Okay, well, here we go. When this giraffe dies, or when this giraffe poops, I guess, and either one, okay, our friendly decomposers will break that down, okay? So nitrogen is flowing from the giraffe into a decomposer, okay, and that decomposer will return that nitrogen to the atmosphere. Okay, so now we have a very simple, okay, diagram of the nitrogen cycle. We're starting in the atmosphere. It's being converted into a usable form by bacteria. They're super important. It's being absorbed by plants, okay, or other producers. Could be algae, could be bacteria. That is being transferred to consumers as they eat those producers. And when those consumers are decomposed, okay, it returns to the atmosphere. And that's the nitrogen cycle. Now, ecology is super fun to study. It's really interesting to take a look at the different types of organisms and the different amount of nutrients or the different levels of biodiversity in an area, but it's really hard. And ecology often involves working in the field, and it's all about counting. So how do I know that in a certain seabird colony that there are 86,000 seabirds? Or how do I know that there are 1.4 million spruce trees in a forest? Surely I'm not counting all of those because that would take me forever. I'd make a ton of errors, and by the time I got done counting them, some of them that I already counted would have died or reproduced and my numbers would be wrong anyways. So how do we do that in ecology? Well, we do that by taking a sample. And ecologists aren't the only people to use samples, okay? We see that a lot, and we're looking at that now with a lot of polling data. So this poll from a while ago said that Hillary Clinton had 59% of the polling data and Donald Trump 34%. Well, that's funny because no one asked me what I thought, and I doubt anyone asked you. So if these pollsters aren't asking everybody, how do they know that 59% of people are supporting Hillary Clinton and 34% Donald Trump? Well, what they did is they took a sample, okay? So they asked a sample of Americans what they thought, and they used that sample to then project onto the whole population. In order for that to work, it has to be a random sample. I'm betting these guys didn't just ask people in Iowa, or they didn't only ask females, or they didn't only ask people under 25. They took a random sample and they hoped that their random sample caught all of the demographics that are present in our country. Well, how do we do that in ecology? Well, we use something called a quadrat. A quadrat is a tool. It's usually a square, although I guess it could be a circle, that covers a certain area. We'll generally be using ones that are 1 meters on all sides, but they can come in different sizes. The thought is to only count a small percentage of our sample. So if this is my area, okay, the thought is to use my quadrat to count the number of individuals in different areas, okay, and then figure out how many quadrats it would take to cover my whole area and extrapolate based on that, okay? So if I find an average of 3, let me get back here. If I find an average of 3 dandelions in each quadrat, and then I figure out that it takes 20 quadrats to cover my whole area, okay, I can assume that there's about 60 dandelions in my whole field. Okay, so the thought with quadrats is to take a small sample, making sure that it's random, and then using that to project data for my whole area. And that's pretty much all we need to know about communities, species, and populations, and getting ready to move forward to the next part of our ecology chapter.